speak your name. There are 26 participants on the call, including you. You are joining your conference as a participant. For a menu of available commands, press *#.
Good morning. This is Tim Peters from the NRCS conference room. Thank you for calling in. You should be able to see the agenda that is currently being presented in the WebEx meeting. If you're having trouble with that, reach out. At this point, we're going to get the meeting started to keep things going on time. First, we have Denise Coleman with the introduction. Denise Coleman, our state conservationist. I'll hand it over to Denise at this point.
Thanks, Tim Peters. And thank you, Tim Kinney, Tim Peters, and Susan Marcourt, who made this WebEx possible. Appreciate all of you who are able to join us. Is anybody on the phone that we are not seeing on the WebEx that we need to take roll call? Is anyone just calling in?
This is Rich Shockey. Can you hear me?
Yes, Rich, we can hear you. Okay, so you're calling in. Okay, very good. Anyone else?
Hathaway Jones. I called in instead of using the computer. I'm not sure if you guys can see me.
Thanks, Hathaway. Okay.
Yes, no problem.
Good afternoon, Denise. Mark to the University of Maryland.
Hi, Mark.
Hello.
Hi, Denise. It's Sonia Jarzoff for Fish and Wildlife Service.
Oh, hi, Sonia.
Hi there. I'm on the webinar, too, but it looks like our names aren't showing up on our little squares on there.
Okay. Okay. Anyone else?
Mark,
Oh.
Hi, Denise and everyone. This is Elsie from Penn State University.
Hi, Elsie. I'm glad you could join us.
Yeah.
This is Jennifer Farbaugh from the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy.
This is Jill Whitcomb from Pennsylvania DEP.
Hey, Jill.
Hi, Denise.
Joe Belka, Pennsylvania DEP.
Yes, how are you?
Dave Lombardo, landowner and TSP.
Frank Schneider, State Conservation Commission.
Hi.
Katie Ombalski, Woods and Waters Consulting.
Thanks, Katie. Anyone else that is joining by phone that's not on the computer? Because we can see on the computer, we can see roll call. So.
Yes, if you've logged in to WebEx using your name, you'll be able to see that you've done that.
Pat Bowling, Pennsylvania DEP.
Hey, Pat. Okay, very good. Hearing no one else, thank you all for joining us. Just housekeeping, if you can *6 if you're on the phone or hit mute, that will help us. We appreciate everybody joining us today. It's a little different circumstances, but we're all getting used to these remote meetings. And I do want to, throughout the, Tim will probably be emceeing most of this, Tim Peters. But I will be probably interjecting a little bit of some things that are going on. As it relates to what is happening with NRCS at this point, just to give you what's happening with COVID-19, we are all working. And our field people are reporting to the field or reporting to the field office, so they are taking turns. There's at least one person occupying every field office. For their safety, we try and keep it to one. And then there are a couple of us that come back and forth through the state office here. But for the most part, folks are teleworking, except when but there is always a presence of a meeting of people working out of the office. Secretary Perdue had asked us to continue to keep our offices open. And with that said, we're in heavy construction season this time of year, so we have a lot of our field folks going out to the field to work with landowners, keeping the safe social distance, doing inspection, planning, and any kind of design work and survey and layout. So just wanted to give you all an update on that. From a perspective of where things are with NRCS, we are still continuing normal operation procedures with program signups. There have been a couple that have been extended, and we'll get into those as we talk today and go through the agenda. But with that said, I'll turn it over to the technical guide report and Pete Vanderstapp, state engineer.
Okay, thank you, Denise. I'm going to fire up my presentation here. And do we see it there, Tim? I'm going to have an amen on that.
Yes, I see it.
We can see it, Pete.
Hey, there's my picture. For those on the phone, the WebEx, I show a picture of myself. This is before my mask, I guess. Anyway, Pennsylvania NRCS engineering update. So we got several things going on. One big program we have in Pennsylvania over the last several years is the dam rehabilitation program, and the one project in Chester County called Hibernia Dam Project. We bid it out last year, didn't have enough funding. We rebid it this year, and it came out at $946,430. We actually did have three bidders, and actually the bid price went down from the last year's bid that we did not have money for. So saved about $150,000 in that process. And we kind of account that to the fact is that last year's bid season was late in the winter. We required a longer work schedule, and the economy is a little different now, so maybe the bidders are a little more hungry. Don't know. But anyway, so dam rehab projects going on. Just to give you an idea of what we're doing on that particular project, we have an emergency spillway, and that spillway is about, I think, 150 feet wide. We're actually going to cut a trench in the middle of that spillway and put a concrete wall in there to make sure that if it ever did flow, it would not erode away. So that's what we're doing on the spillway. We're removing a berm on the downstream side of the dam. You can see a picture there. There's a rock channel that runs across the middle of the dam there. We're going to actually take that rock away and reshape that so that when the water comes down off the slope, it doesn't infiltrate into the dam anymore. It keeps on going. And then at the lower end, around the outlet structure, we're going to improve the drain type of material and structures around there. So a bunch of different projects, but still $900,000 worth of work. Emergency Watershed Protection Program. I show a picture there of the riprap work on one of our jobs. And kind of a quick summary, we had 93 sites that we awarded for cost share starting in 2018 and mainly 2019. We had 28 separate sponsors. And right now we're happy to say that we only have exactly one site left. It's for $99,999. And that project is slated to start, a lot of background noise, start here in May and be done by June. So we should be able to wrap all that stuff up. And just kind of summary, NRCS cost share is 75% of the project, and we going to spend, we spent $3.9 million plus the 100 will be at $4 million for federal dollars involved. And DEP came through with the remaining 25%, or about $1.32 million. So happily we get that project done, and hopefully we do not see EWP in the near future. So that's a good thing. And the last thing, emergency milk disposal fact sheet. as you all know, that there's been a little bit of surplus of milk out there because of supply chain issues, and some of our dairy farmers, or a lot of the dairy farmers in Pennsylvania, have been asked to either reduce production by 15%, or here and there they're actually going to dump their milk for a day or two to waste that milk away until they get things resupplied. So NRCS developed a fact sheet for their staff that kind of answer the question, what can you do with waste of milk? The good news is most of the milk is actually being, hate to say this, stored in the manure storage, and then it'll be land applied sometime this spring. The interesting thing about milk is actually a really good fertilizer. It has an N value that's 3 times higher than regular manure, and because of that, if you would try direct application of waste milk, you probably shouldn't exceed 4,500 gallons per acre, because that'll yield about 200 pounds of nitrogen. So you wouldn't cover very many acres, but certainly it's a high in nutrient value. The other thing we want to alert our staff and to our participants is that putting milkhouse waste in a vegetated treatment area or a waste storage under animal housing is not recommended. The waste treatment area, you'd overload the BODs and nitrogen and everything else in that little area, and that wouldn't be good. And certainly for animal housing, if your cows are on top of the manure storage, adding all this milkhouse waste might cause dangerous gas generation along with a lot of bad odors, so not recommended. The last thing is we all know that the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, the State Conservation Commission have put out a lot of good guidelines on how to handle the milk waste and the application rates and all that kind of stuff, and that information is getting out to all the producers across Pennsylvania. I believe we have over 5,000 producers of milk in Pennsylvania. And the last topic, as you know, every year we do a Boot Camp 1 and Boot Camp 2. Boot Camp 1 and 2. Somebody shuffling papers in the background there, folks. Boot Camp 1 and 2, and after 20 years, we held the first Boot Camp 1 as a WebEx-based training. So what we did there was we had 4 days of 3 hours per day of WebEx-type stuff, and then what we're going to do is have 2 days of field activities in September. So we wanted to keep this program going. We did that. Boot Camp 2 is going to be rescheduled for the fall. There was too much time in the field. We just couldn't make it a web-based training. And we have several other trainings scheduled in the near future, and probably at least a few of those will be scheduled as WebEx trainings with a day or two of field work sometime in the fall, assuming all things go well. And that wraps up the engineering situation at this time in Pennsylvania. I pass it on to the next presenter. Back to you, Tim.
Thank you, Pete. I'm going to jump in just with one more housekeeping item. If you happen to use the audio through the computer instead of calling in with your phone, please make sure that you are muting the audio within WebEx. If you're using the phone, that's great, but make sure you're muting the phone. Our next presentation will be from Mark Goodson, our state agronomist at the NRCS State Office. And Mark, if you just give me 1 second, I will get your presentation up.
Thank you, Tim. I'm acting state resource conservationist for a few weeks now, and so I'll be presenting the Ecological Sciences Field Office Tech Guide update report here. Oh, and here we are. So we'll have a few topics here. We're in a Federal Register comment period at this time. We have some new assessment. We have new assessment tools in our tech guide. We've also got some job approval authority phase-in policies that we're doing. The next slide, please. Next slide. A public inspection notification was made on the Federal Register for 49 conservation practice standards. Previous slide, please. Which will be officially available for public comment beginning March 24th and lasting 30 days. So that public comment period is winding up quickly, but it is still open. The public inspection notification is available at the website, and I believe you'll be able to get a copy of these in our meeting notes afterwards, if you'd like to check into that URL later today or in the next few days to make a public comment on these 49 conservation practice standards. Next slide, please. Early in 2020, our national office released an updated natural resource concern list and planning criteria. This is the document, is the official list of NRCS resource concerns and planning criteria that's used to determine resource treatment levels using conservation planning practices and planning process. So this is the first time it's been updated in probably 7-8 years, and that is in our tech guide. Also in our tech guide are a number of new and revised assessment tools that our planners use when assessing resources. The pasture conditioning scoring guidance has been revised, and we'll begin training on that this coming summer so that people who are working with pasture conditioning scoring are familiar with all the changes. There is a new cropland infield soil health assessment guidance worksheet, and that is to be used to assess soil health resource concerns by working through a series of infield soil health indicators. The Pennsylvania Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Guidance has been revised, as well as additional Pennsylvania Cultural Resources Review Guidance. And finally, here we are in the midst of rolling in a new national policy to require job approval authority for those planners and apprentice planners and technicians and so forth who are planning and designing and certifying ecological job science practices in the field during the planning process. This has been so there are instructions that are posted in the tech guide, and initial job approval authorities have been assigned to our currently certified and current apprentice planners. This affects all the NRCS planning staff as well as partners and affiliates. TSPs fall under a different set of rules, so they're not affected by this, but something that affiliates and partners and our NRCS staff are going to be working through in the next 9 months or so to fully implement. And with that, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. We appreciate that. Our next presentation will be from Yuri Plowden, our state soil scientist in the NRCS state office. Yuri, it's all yours. I'll bring up your presentation in 1 minute.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Yeah, hi. Just wanted to give you just an update about soils data. Go ahead and advance it one. So I wanted to let you know that there is a new web soil survey report. It was just made available yesterday. It's called Poultry Mortality Disposal by Composting, and I'll show you how to get there in just a bit. This report is one of several interpretations available in Web Soil Survey for catastrophic disaster planning, and it serves any of these reports, they serve as a starting point for finding suitable sites on your land for large-scale animal disposal. And of course, Pennsylvania soils can be very limiting, and so sometimes these interps come up as all red on the map, all limiting. So sometimes an on-site investigation might still be recommended. So go ahead and advance it. So here's where you would find it. You go into Web Soil Survey, and you would delineate your area of interest, and this is a little farm in Lebanon County. And you would go to, after you do your area of interest, you go to your Soil Data Explorer tab. See, I guess I'm not presenting, so you can't see my cursor, but there's a tab up top, so Soil Data Explorer, and then you go to Suitabilities and Limitations for Use. And if you look at the table of contents, thank you, I see the cursor moving, there's a bunch of reports, and one of the categories is disaster recovery planning. And you'll see several different reports about catastrophic large animal mortality burial, incineration, pit disposal. This poultry mortality disposal by composting was one that was tweaked by our previous state soil scientist and our resource soil scientist to give you a little bit better interpretation for Pennsylvania soil. So if you were to compare that map on the right to the national one composting facility surface, the map would be all red, and this one allows, and that's mostly because of karst. Parent bedrock material is considered highly limiting in the national TURP, and our Pennsylvania TURP gives a little more leeway, particularly if it's a deep soil. Okay, go ahead and advance it. So also just to let you know, when you go into Web Soil Survey, you will see this little blue box that says Web Soil Survey Status Update. So there is a new version, 3.2, and there'll be some live links that says see what's new and known problems. So go ahead and advance that. And so then it brings you this page, and it just tells you what changed. So I heard somebody, maybe they just weren't muted. Okay, so it basically it just removed some tabs and information and links that weren't working anyway. So ecological site assessment tab is something you won't see anymore, and there were some other bug fixes. So it should run a little better, and basically just getting rid of stuff that hadn't been well populated anyway. Go ahead, Tim. So just remember that Web Soil Survey is the official NRCS soils data. And as yet, there is no annually refreshed live layer on ArcGIS Online. That's come across as a question from some users. If they're on the ArcGIS Online platform, is there a live soils layer? And that's refreshed, that they don't have to worry about, and there is none at this time. There are some soils layers on there that some folks downloaded and posted, but nothing yet that's coming directly from NRCS Soil Survey Division. Go ahead. And so speaking of annual data refresh, every year, the soil survey data is uploaded again. Soil scientists are constantly working to improve the underlying data. Usually you won't see much, and there's not a lot of line work, but they're trying to harmonize and improve the data consistency across counties and across state lines, and from like soil series to like soil series. And so they've moved up that annual refresh date. Used to be in the fall, and now they've moved it up to July 1st. So if you plug into soils data on June 30th, and then you try again like after the July 4th holidays, and you notice a little bit of a difference, that's why, because the data was refreshed. And if you need more information about that, please contact me. There's a report that I'm able to run that says what some of the changes are, if you really need to know that. And I think that is it for me.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Yuri. Our next presenter will be Jim Gillis, our state biologist for NRCS. Jim, I'll hand it over to you, and I'll bring up your presentation right now.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you well, Jim.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to give a very quick presentation today on the wetland functional assessments that NRCS has to develop for the purpose of implementing the Food Security Act. Whenever the gray section disappears, Tim, go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. Okay, but I want to start with a very, very important statement, and that this idea of a functional assessment only applies to USDA participants. It does not apply to the USDA agencies. What that means is that, in a nutshell, NRCS has to continue to follow our own internal regulations and policies for wetlands. And that means that still, going forward, our first rule is that we have to avoid negative wetland impacts whenever possible, period. If there's a wetland on the landscape, even if the USDA participant can do something with that wetland, that doesn't necessarily mean that NRCS can. So for us, nothing really changes by this functional assessment, or very little changes for us. Our first rule of thumb is always going to be to avoid wetlands whenever possible. Next slide, Tim. However, the 2018 Farm Bill actually had wording written into it that became law that requires that NRCS has to conduct a functional assessment on any wetland acres affected by manipulation or conversion to verify that those acres were providing the functions and values of a wetland before USDA as a whole can deem the operation ineligible for benefits. So what that big legalese phrase translates into in plain English is just a very simple question. Was the manipulated or converted area truly a functional wetland before it was manipulated or converted? And the reason this question came up is there's been a lot of pressure nationally for justification of what we're calling converted wetlands. And the two pictures on this slide are actually, I included these specifically to give an example. Obviously, the top picture of that forested wetland, yes, this is a wetland that anybody should look at that and say, yeah, we don't want to manipulate this wetland. There are problems here. If we lose the functionality of this wetland, that's not a good thing. The wetland in the bottom picture is a slightly different story. That one would be questionable as to whether or not that one's behaving and functioning and providing wetland benefits in its current condition. So again, this is why we at NRCS have to come up with this functional assessment. We're required to by law, and we're supposed to be able to distinguish between two wetland types like the ones you see on the screen here. So as anybody who works with wetlands knows, nope, go back please. So the functions of wetlands are relative, and they're based on a variety of different features. Not every wetland is the same. Not every wetland works the same or provides the same benefits. But there are those functions that are important enough to warrant protection in every case. And we're going to hopefully address those through screening questions. And now you can go on, Tim. And I don't want to belabor the screening questions because we do only have 15 minutes, but I wanted to give an example of what we're considering here. So for example, if a project is going to happen in an area that contains threatened or endangered species, or they suspected to exist in the area, then that project is not eligible for a functional assessment. That's a no-go. That's a non-starter as soon as it occurs. Doesn't matter how small the wetland is, what type of wetland it is. If there are T&E species involved, it's done. It's done. We don't even consider a functional assessment. Is it part of a mitigation project, long-term easement, or some other restrictive covenant? If so, they're not eligible for a functional assessment from us, and so on. You can see there's a variety of questions here. One of the ones, well, actually the last two I want to point out, is when fully installed, will the land project disturb more than 1 acre of wetland? And if the answer to that is yes, right now we have it set that that project is not eligible. So anything larger than an acre of impact is not eligible for functional assessment. And the next one is anything less than 0.05 acres, so 5/100ths of an acre. If it's less than that, then they automatically get they can automatically have a functional assessment that says that area is so small that losing it is probably not a big deal. Both of these numbers right now are totally subjective. And one of the reasons we're doing this presentation today is we're going to ask for folks to provide input to us and some feedback for it. So the 1 acre in particular is just kind of a placeholder for now. I had to insert that so that we could get the spreadsheet to work. However, the 5/100ths of an acre, that value and the idea of anything less of less of an impact than that being automatically approved from the DEP general permit process. So there is a basis for that 0.05. It would make us match other agencies that are reviewing and approving wetland impacts. Next slide, please, Tim. However, not all of those characteristics are as cut and dry as those screening questions. Some of them are relative to one another. There are sometimes a standalone importance. Sometimes it's a combination of features that makes the wetland important. Some of those things to be considered are the size of the wetland itself, how connected is it hydrologically to other areas or other streams, how's it being used or managed, what's the frequency of saturation, what's the duration of the saturation. A wetland that's wet for 3 months of the year is going to have a much higher value or benefit or function than a wetland that might only be really saturated for 5 days or less of the year. So these are topics that may or may not, depending on how they're combined, and either in combination or alone, affect the functional values of the wetlands. And these are the ones that are a little bit harder to pin down typically. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the functional assessment for an existing or planned functional assessment for an existing wetland so that we can say this is what's on the landscape as of right now, and it lets us determine is that wetland providing functions and values or not. Obviously, if it's not providing functions and values, then the functional assessment would be granted at that point, and we can say, well, you're looking at a wetland that's only 1/100th of an acre in size. It's more than 300 feet from other surface waters. It's saturated less than 15 days per year, and only once in every 4 years. Go ahead and manipulate that area. But that would be very different from, say, 2/10 of a forested wetland that's within 100 feet of surface waters, saturated for more than 30 days a year, every year. So what we're trying to do is sort of determine the differences and find these relative values and then establish some thresholds for what is an acceptable loss of wetlands and what is not. So this is a calculation that looks at the existing wetland functions. Next one, Tim. And then there's a very similar calculation that happens for the wetland functions that are expected to be present after the project is installed. So if that first wetland assessment comes back and says, yes, this area is providing functional values and benefits and is functioning as a true wetland, then our next step is to say, well, after the project, if you're going to do this thing out here, will it still be functioning as a wetland, or will it be damaged to the point where it's no longer a wetland? If it's going to be still functioning as a wetland and there's enough space, enough size to it remaining, then chances are good we could possibly approve a project there. However, if the after condition is that those functions are going to be degraded, the size is going to be taken down too small, then that functional assessment would not be approved, and they would have to find another way to do the project that they have in mind. So one more time on the slides, please, Tim. Okay, so this is the important part. As I said earlier, this assessment is not set in stone. It is very much in the draft and working stages right now. We desperately would like to have input from others so that we can get a more rounded approach. I know there are other rapid assessments and things like that that are available, and I had tried to include as many of those features as I could here. However, very few of those were specifically designed for farmland. And they may have rapid in the title, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are rapid in the real world. So we had to come up with something a little bit different. But I would welcome any interest or any participation from anybody on the call or any folks that you guys work with. All you have to do is contact me at the email address given here, and I will share this draft assessment with you, and we'll work through it and see if we can get some good comments and some good feedback and try to improve and refine this project as much as possible. I can't stress enough that we really, really do want feedback and help with this. We don't want to draft this alone in terms of, well, here's what NRCS is going to do. We realize that wetlands are a landform that spans a lot of our different agencies' purviews, and we want to be as close to in line with everyone else as we can, given that we are also working in an agricultural landscape that is sometimes a little bit different from some of the other areas that folks work in. But please give it some thought, and if you're interested in chiming in or possibly helping out with some feedback, please let me know. Again, at that email address there on your screen. And with that, I'll stop here. I don't know if anybody has any questions, but I'll try to take them if there's time.
Jim, this is Denise. Just to report back that your deadline for completion of this is July of this year, right?
Yes.
So we will present the findings of the committee on July meeting of the State Technical Committee.
Yes, by that time I'm hoping to actually have the finished product, and if we're back to meeting in person, I'll actually have it up on the screen there in the office, and we may even run through an example if we have time.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Do we have any other questions for Jim? And before we move on to the next presenter, do we have any other questions for our other presenters? I moved quickly through those. Do we have anything for Pete Vanderstappen, for Mark Goodson, or for Yuri Plowden?
So just before we go into the program's dialogue, I just want to bring folks up to speed on where we are with our new automation system. We are moving to CART, which is a Conservation Assessment Rating Tool. That's what it stands for. And so every field and every resource concern on every field is being assessed by our field employees at this time before it gets put into our ranking so that we can show true outcomes on a site-specific basis. As you know, we use SEEP to show statistically sampled outcomes for conservation. But this automation system that we are using will actually show the site-specific outcomes related to those practices implemented. So while our field people are doing that, it's an extreme amount of time and effort that's involved to revamp. It works through our conservation desktop platform, which is also new this year to our field folks. So as we move out on this, it's an extremely new setup for everyone in the field who's doing work with NRCS, and how it moves through the ranking cycle is we have yet to rank any of our applications that have come in for our fiscal year 20 sign up, but that is the intent, and then of course by the end of the year award those contracts. So just a little bit, each program manager is going to go over their deadlines, but please keep in mind that some of these, there are some critical deadlines that we're going to talk about with as it relates to CSP, as it relates to the state CIG, as it relates to RCPP, Classic and AFA, the alternative funding arrangements. So and just ask the presenters as you go over those, you just repeat the deadlines for folks because they have changed. Some of them have been extended. And the one for the chief has extended something that didn't catch up with the public affairs. So as we go through that, we'll make sure that to note that. And then one more thing, I just wanted to do a shout out to Audrey Mays, who, Audrey, are you there?
I am, thank you.
Audrey is the new CREP coordinator for FSA, the Farm Service Agency, and while she doesn't have a presentation today, Audrey, I just thought you would like to introduce yourself and just, you know, say when your start date is and just welcome.
Awesome, thank you. Audrey Mays, recent grad from Penn State University and for system management. I'm excited to be working with the Farm Service Agency and working with the farmers and helping with their conservation plans in that respect and with the NRCS. So, and my start date is May 10th of this year. Well,
welcome, Audrey. Glad to have you and look forward to presentations by you in the future. So thank you for joining us. With that said, Tim?
Sure. Thank you, Audrey and Denise. One more thing on WebEx. I should have mentioned this earlier, but there is a chat feature. If you have questions or comments during the presentation, I'll try to monitor that, keep an eye on it, so you can feel free to send a message to me or specific people using the WebEx chat feature. And with that, we'll move on to our next presentation. Barry France, our Assistant State Conservationist for Programs out of the Harrisburg NRCS State Office. Barry, I've got your presentation up, so feel free to take it away.
Okay, thanks, Tim. And before we get in, just want to have a few words on the presenters. Ed Sanders, who was our Pennsylvania AMA and EQIP coordinator for many years, retired at the end of March. So he's not working for us as a federal employee. He may be helping out as a contractor. But anyway, Zenit Crespo is coming in behind Ed to be on a detail as the acting EQIP coordinator. So I'll be presenting the portions of the session that Ed otherwise would have covered on EQIP and AMA. Ashley Lenning is going to be following me with some more in-depth details about CSP and CIG and some of the NWQI source water protection activities. So I'm going to go over, overview of what we're doing here, and I'll preface by picking up where Denise mentioned about our conservation assessment grading tool. It's a new program for the agency nationwide, and it's coinciding with bringing out some of the new Farm Bill regulations. And for that reason, we're trying to minimize other changes that we're making into our system because of these two big changes that we're dealing with, which is the new Farm Bill regulations and the new computer tool to help us plan with landowners and farmers. So a lot of what we're doing this year on concepts on how we rank applications, factors we've looked at, we're intentionally trying to keep them as close as possible to last year and maybe even eliminating a few questions, especially if they tend to be redundant, just to make things a little simpler for us to get through because essentially we have about a half a year to get in a full year's worth of contracting. So the slide Tim has up now shows our conservation programs under the Farm Bill. What I'm going to be covering is the AMA and the EQIP on the left side under conservation programs and a little bit of the RCPP version of that. We're in a transition right now on RCPP. I think Susan may be covering some of the new versions that came out with the new Farm Bill. We still have both program money and contracts, active contractors with landowners under the prior version of RCPP, where we might be having an RCPP-CSP contract or an RCPP-EQIP contract. So we still have funds for those versions under the 2014 Farm Bill and active contracts. So I'll be talking a little bit about that. Okay, next slide. Could you advance one slide? Okay, thanks. Ag management assistance. I'll go over some of the allocations later, but AMA, we typically get a small amount of funding because the national allocation for AMA nationwide is not very large. It's typically for 16, 17 states. It's a subset of risk management funding. So we don't have enough funding to make it worthwhile to have a statewide sign up for AMA. So we've rotated it across the state for several years now just to target it to the three administrative areas, which are the West, the Northeast, and the Southeast. This year we're targeting the money to the Southeast, and because of the amount of our funding, we're targeting it to these 5 counties. And you can see the kinds of things we're funding. The nice thing about AMA is it's got a little more flexibility to fund practices like irrigation. We can fund new irrigation in AMA as well as our traditional practices that we can fund in EQIP. So we like to use this in areas where there's an interest in irrigation. A lot of the same people who grow specialty crops also like irrigation, but we find there's some people with field crops also. So we have about $360,000 allocation for AMA this year. Okay, next slide. And advance one. Okay, Ashley's going to be covering CSP in more detail than me, but I put it in here just to keep an alphabetical order. And we have the three general options in CSP. We have the regular new signups that we've had, I'll say, since the 2008 Farm Bill under this version. And we have this renewal contract option, whereas people who have coming off their first contract and they've successfully met all the contract requirements can request to have a renewal option. So we offer that. And in the 2018 Farm Bill, there was added this Grassland Conservation Initiative, which is targeting people who have base acres with FSA, and they would like to put those base acres into conservation cover, typically at hay or pasture. So we get a little bit of business from those folks. Okay, next slide. And these are the national list of enhancements. Mentioning this, and I'll go through it with EQIP also. Between CSP and EQIP, we have a lot of conservation treatments we can offer farmers. Probably more than they can comprehend, which makes it a little challenging sometimes to go through between CSP and EQIP, all the tools we have to help address the problem. But on the good side, we have a pretty complete toolbox. Okay, next slide. And those are some of the things that CSP covers. Okay, next slide. And I'm zipping through CSP because Ashley's going to cover that in more detail. Spend a little bit more time on EQIP. This is the one where we get the majority of our conservation funds. As I mentioned, we're trying to keep things the same as prior years because of this complexity with the new Farm Bill and the new CART system. We have similar national initiatives, state priorities, activity plans, and I'll be going over some of these. But if you've been participating in the state tech committee meetings in prior years, what we have this year is largely the same as what we had in prior years. Okay, next slide. A couple of changes for the folks interested in the organic option. This is a nice change. It raises the payment limit cap to $140,000, and this is part of the $450,000 limit they have in the Farm Bill for EQIP. So if someone signs up for the EQIP organic option and they can compete only against other people in the organic, it raises their chance of getting funding. They can get up to $140,000 for this. And their remaining regular EQIP option, they still have $310,000 to get up to their $450,000. But this helps make it a little more possible for the folks in organic operations to get funding. It also got rid of the annual payment limit for organic. Could you go back one? Got rid of the annual $20,000 organic payment limit, so people could get $140,000 in 1 year under organic, which is really nice for those, I'll say, dairy farmers who have an organic operation that might want funding for something like manure management system, manure storage. That $20,000 cap we had under the old Farm Bill really stopped them from effectively competing for waste storage funding. With a $140,000 cap, they become competitive for that as something they could consider. And we've had these advanced payment options in the past for the historically underserved, and that's just been reinforced in a new Farm Bill that we can give some advanced payments for anticipated costs of practices up to 90 days ahead of time and help them finance those practices. Okay, now next slide. Some of the national initiatives, and these are essentially fund codes that people can sign up for. So if someone is interested in a conservation activity plan, they can apply for that, and they're competing only against other people interested in a conservation activity plan. They don't have to compete for funding against people who want manure storage funding or cover crops funding. We have an amount of money for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. We've got the 3 counties in Pennsylvania. Potter County, Genesee River flows into Lake Ontario to the north. And Erie County and Crawford County has some land that drains into Lake Erie. So we get some special money, really courtesy of EPA, that helps us fund that. We have a National High Tunnel Initiative. We have funding, and this is by the Farm Bill, that we have to set aside for beginning farmers and socially disadvantaged farmers. That's a total of 10% of our EQIP money for those two categories combined that we should set aside for those contracts, assuming we get applications for it. And I'll say, especially for beginning farmers, we typically have a lot of interest. We get maybe 20% of our applications, 20 to 25% are from beginning farmers, and they get about the same proportion of our funding. We have the National Water Quality Initiative. It's a national partnership with EPA and NRCS, and Ashley will cover that. We have On-Farm Energy Initiative, Organic Initiative I've mentioned, and the Working Lands for Wildlife in Pennsylvania. That's for the golden winged warbler, which is forestry habitat. We've had that since about 2012. We've had a lot of interest. Last year we had a pretty good year, about maybe $1 million put into golden winged warbler contracts. This year we've had about $800,000 allocation for that. So we're looking forward to another good year in that. So those are the national initiatives that the states have to offer if they're applicable, and these are the ones that are applicable for us. And those are all ones that we've seen before. Thank you, Tim. State priorities, and these are all things that we've seen before. You know, the cropland, we would hope to do a lot of our soil health work on cropland through that fund category. We have the forestry funding option, grazing and livestock, poultry. Stream corridor management, I want to mention, we've offered that for a few years now to fund things like livestock exclusion, repairing buffers, whether it's herbaceous or forested, cattle crossings. We're looking to use this also for things like fish habitat improvements, getting involved with some of the legacy sediment projects, working in partnership with other agencies where we might fund part of a dam removal project, maybe not the dam removal itself in all cases, but some of the other restoration work. And on small dams, we can actually get involved with some of that also. But that's a fund code that we're hoping to use with, I guess, broader application and some new innovative projects moving forward, even though we had it for about 4 to 5 years now. Okay, next slide. Activity plans. I think there's about 15 different kinds of conservation activity plans that are available. And the ones that we get the most interest are and the ones you can see there. And I'll say especially that first one, Comprehensive Nutrient Management Plan and Forest Management Plan. And I will add, we're trying to do a little follow-up to see just how much work results from any of these activity plans. We do them. It's literally a no obligations plan for the farmer landowner. They don't have to follow the plan, but it gives them a nice plan put together by a technical service provider on how they could manage the land. And because it's all voluntary implementation, if they choose to do that, we don't always know if they've done anything to follow up on those plans. So we are trying to get a handle on that as we decide, are these plans a good use of our funding? If farmers implement them on their own, landowners, that's good. They don't have to implement it with Farm Bill money, but we do hope they implement it somehow. So we're looking into that. Other ones that we get some interest on, not as much as the top 3 of those ones you can see there listed. Ag Energy Management Plan has been popular with some of the farmers who want to do some energy efficiency improvements under that on-farm energy efficiency option. And that typically saves them quite a bit of money on things like lighting, sometimes heating. The one at the bottom is a new one that we had the technical description, but we're not planning on offering it this year because we just don't feel ready to offer this. This is that Soil Health Management Plan. The caution we have about wanting to wait till next fiscal year is that there's no TSP certified to offer that, and we're not confident that farmers can find labs to do the soil health testing. We'd like to spend the rest of this half of this year to be working on both getting some TSPs interested in being certified and in finding labs that can do the required soil health testing that plan would entail. But that's for people who want to do a really in-depth analysis of their soils, of cropland, critically pasture, other land uses, and how they could improve it.
Barry, let's clarify, just to clarify, the national office hasn't put out this template for the soil health cap as of yet. So that's kind of where we are. It's not an internal Pennsylvania issue. It's more of a national issue that we're waiting for a release.
Yeah, it's both. There's really not criteria for the soil health testing as a standalone item. And then the management plan, which is relying on soil health testing, is also really not ready to move forward. So it's kind of a two-part reason for saying, let's just take a pause on offering that this year, and we don't want to get farmers frustrated that we get, say, sign up for this, and then there's no testing available. Or in this case, no consultants either. Okay, next slide. Ashley's going to cover CIG a little bit more in depth. I'm just listing here to go through some of the EQIP funding options that we have. Okay, so next slide. Okay, practices. I mentioned a lot of them for CSP. These are the state-listed items that we have available. So there's an awful lot. Any given contract, it may be as little as one item if it's a conservation activity plan. I think the common contract we have might have between 3 and 8 practices. Some have more, picking from that list of 106. And then there's over 1,000 different scenarios or options on how those practices are implemented. So there's a lot of choices here that our planners need to work with the applicant on to select the right practice, and then the right design, and then the right payment option for them. So this is why, when we start talking about this year, we're trying to keep it simple. We already have a lot of options in the system, and we're really hoping we can get this new CART system working to help us sort these options out with the farmers, the applicants, and give them a good plan that meets what they want to do. Okay, next one. Next slide. Mentioned reducing complexity moving forward where we can. This is what we have on the books already. By program, and I've sorted out the different farm bills that we have funding provided to us from and the remaining contracts under them. I'm not going to go over each line item. The reason you see some from the 2008 Farm Bill, we would have signed some of those contracts in 2012 and 2013. So EQIP at the time does have a 10-year maximum contract limit. So we're coming to the end of the allowable time frame for an EQIP contract from those 2012-13 contracts. And for WIP, the bottom line, that had a 15-year option that we used for some of the forestry and wildlife activities where we knew we didn't want to do all the work in 3 years. Forestry takes a little bit longer to respond to treatments. So we had some contracts that were, let's say, 12, 13-year-long contracts to allow the forest land to adapt to a treatment. Then we'd go in after it had more or less, adapted to a treatment, we would do a follow-up treatment. So that's why you see some of those older contracts there. And you'll see from the EQIP 2014 and CSP 2014 farm bills, we still have a lot of contracts, a lot of activities yet on the book, and a lot of dollars outstanding. So we're looking forward to working with those landowners, farmers to get that work done. We know with the coronavirus and its impact on income, we'll be listening closely to our participants to, make sure we can help them get this work done. We know it's a tough time for everyone. But these are the contracts, and Denise said we're still out there in the land doing work. These are what we're doing work on. Okay, next.
Oh, then we're looking to add probably about another 400, 450 contracts onto this existing 1,700 contract workload at this point. Right, Barry?
That's correct.
Part of the issue, you're going to hear us talk about why we're not going to add some new things into the state. Part of the issue is with the 1,700 contracts of workload meshed with the new 400 to 450 contracts we're adding. A lot of these practices that we thought were going to stay on schedule are probably not going to stay on schedule. because of the COVID-19. So we're taking into account of what our field capacity is out there and what we can handle at this point. And so as we talk about, some people have brought before the State Technical Committee today about adding new priority areas or other things. We're probably not going to do that because of the situation that we don't have enough contracts moving off at this point, just because we need the economy, the fact that contractors themselves can't work because they don't have exemptions. So there's a lot of things going on at this point in time. And so as we talk about, I know that there are some folks when we get to NWQI and other things to have discussions about, we're leaning towards if we can continue and stay the status quo with this year, that's what we're going to do rather than adding any new priority areas either to NWQI or other priorities. Thanks, Barry.
Yeah, thanks. And so I think this reinforced what Denise just said. You saw the existing workload, even if we don't do any new contracts, and that was quite a bit of existing workload. So this is the funding for new contracting. As Denise said, we might get, let's say, 450 contracts from that. It varies depending on what we end up funding and the cost of it. Of this, the top three lines, AMA, CSP, EQIP, are new funding, 2020 funding. That CSP line, the RCPP line was some carryover for the existing approved projects from 2018. And that does not include any new projects that we might be working on this year. And Susan Marquardt will talk about new projects. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Okay. That was it. More information, farmers.gov. Just remember that's kind of the one-stop shop for information about USDA programs. Next slide is recommendation to go onto our website and sign up for Pennsylvania updates. You can get information not only about NRC Pennsylvania programs, but other national or other states that you'd like, but that's a good way to get updated. And I'll stop there. I guess, Tim, we could have questions now or at the end of Ashley's.
Yeah, we can do questions. Does anybody have any questions for Barry? Thank you, Barry.
Yep. Yeah, hey, this is Dave Lombardo.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yep.
Yeah. Hey, just a real fast question that kind of ties in. It sounds like you're keeping the practices the same. You're not going to update the practices that came through the Federal Register, and you'll keep the same ones you had last year. And you seem to be behind in notifying folks whether potentially they might have funding under the various EQIP programs. I guess I mainly deal in forestry. I didn't know if you were behind, if this was going to happen soon, or if you can shed some light on that. And then we tie into the CSP. I know in the past I would know quite early. You might not have the contracts, but, as the season's progressing for forestry, you're losing a big window for certain practices such as tree planting and herbicide and whatnot. So
I'll try to answer the first one then as far as notifying people. And we put out news releases through, I'll say, the usual media, Lancaster Farming and papers, and our public affairs person does that. We don't have a distribution list per se or a newsletter that we send out to everyone. The people with existing contracts will give them a reminder letter that comes from the local field office that, dear participant, you have a contract and these are the things that you're scheduled to do this year. So those folks should get an individual letter for each contract, but we don't have a general.
Well, I guess I was looking at the newer for this fiscal year for 20. You know, usually you have rankings and stuff, but yeah.
Dave, I can answer your question. So yes, we are behind. This CART new automation system put us 6 months behind in the fiscal year. Generally speaking, by now, we have started ranking and notifying landowners of accepted contracts. We always like April 1st to be a good cutoff deadline. Because of the new Farm Bill, all the new regulations that had to be written and all the new automation systems that came up with that, we are 6 months into the fiscal year, and currently we usually like to be in this place usually around December or January. So we are behind. The situation that you asked about the practices, those practices that are published for Federal Register comment are national practice standards at this point in time. They are revisions to the national practice standards. What happens is we'll take a look at the national practice standards, see how applicable those practice standards are to Pennsylvania, and they may come up for review in Pennsylvania as practices are updated. So usually we get teams together, take a look at those practices, and we may go out with a Pennsylvania state standard that it needs to be compatible with the national standard, but it can be more restrictive. So to meet state laws and regulations and perhaps look at certain endangered species. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Well, I guess if it happens, it would be more likely happening in FY21 than in FY20, any changes.
Yeah, that would be right. Yeah.
Changes to the practice standard for sure. And Dave, when Denise was mentioning, I remembered I didn't give some of the dates, so I'll give them quickly. So for EQIP and AMA and RCPP EQIP, our application due date to be considered for the first evaluation cycle was March 20, so we're past that. For CSP, there's a national date that we have to have the CSP application date no earlier than June 1. It has to be after May 29th, which is a Friday, so we said ours is June 1st, and that's by national direction, so we have time to process the renewals, and then those folks can go into the regular CSP if they don't be offered a renewal contract. So CSP, we're still accepting applications. And we have a national obligation date for the CSP, the regular sign-up, by the end of July. EQIP, we're still in the process of doing the rankings, and so there's some national obligation date of early September. We have ours in more or less mid-August, so we give ourselves time to make sure we get it done. So we have some really tight deadlines here to get this obligation done for 2020, and of course the ranking goes along with it. So when we're saying, hey, you won't hear some information on some of these things till 2021, that might be the new practice standards, but the contracting, we expect to be done with that in 2020. But it's just going to be getting word out to the applicants a little later than we normally would.
Do you think it'll be like July, August of this year?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I'd say June, July, August.
Okay. That's what I was looking for, with a little bit more definitive and stuff. Thanks.
Okay. Other questions? Okay.
All right. Thank you. Tim? Thank you, Barry. We appreciate that. There was one more question to elaborate on NW2I, but I believe Ashley's going to cover that a little bit more. So I think that's a good segue. Ashley, it's all yours, and I've got your presentation up and ready to go.
Hi, everybody. This is Ashley Lenig. I'm manage some conservation programs out of the state office, so I'm going to give you an update on the programs that I manage. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give you the roadmap here, what we're going to be covering, talk about some opportunities through conservation innovation grants. I'm going to touch on a lot of the work I'm doing right now with the Conservation Stewardship Program. We'll talk about NWQI, National Water Quality Initiative, which is under EQIP, Environmental Quality and Standards Program, as well as talk a little bit about high priority and source water protection practices. Next slide. Okay, so very kind of mentioned this a bit ago, but we have different options with CSP, which does tend to make things a little bit confusing. But basically, there was an option for folks that had contracts that were expiring to extend them an additional year. So one of the options they had was they could extend 1 year, they could renew for their existing contract for an additional 5 years, or they could basically let their contract expire, not continue in the Conservation Stewardship Program. So right now we have folks working with the ranking process in our Conservation Assessment and Ranking tool. So they're doing planning and ranking. Then the next thing that we'll be doing is the CSP Classic. So that's the regular, traditional Conservation Stewardship Program that's been around for a long time. That sign up. You got a little feedback there. Okay, and then we have different categories for the renewals and Classic. So we have a regular category, we have a beginning farmer and rancher funding category, socially disadvantaged farmer and rancher, funding pool, they're actually called, ranking pool they're called, or funding code, funding accounts. And there's also going to be a new one for this year called organic. So as Barry mentioned with our renewals, that is competitive this year. So if they don't rank high enough, then they can compete in the regular or CSP Classic sign-up. So we think it's a little bit of a bumpy road because we're just kind of starting out with, oh, we're on the next slide. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so we're working with these ranking questions. This is the first program to go through, first financial assistance program to go through this process of working with the new Conservation Desktop, which replaced our mapping and planning software that we used previously. It's also the first to go through this Conservation Assessment Ranking tool. So we've had to develop the ranking questions, put them in the system, and go through that process. And of course, it's always a little bumpy when you're starting something new. So for any of our CSPs, whether it's renewal or classic, we do have categories underneath that. So CSP Ag Lands category stands for agricultural land, includes cropland and pasture. You can also include farmstead and associated ag land in that, in those contracts. And then for the other option would be non-industrial private forest land, and that can also include those land uses of farmstead and associated ag land. Next. So you might want to know what our ranking questions are like. Our new CART system has a place to put an applicability, which basically kicks the application either in and out of the area. So it might be, are you in Pennsylvania, or are you a beginning farmer? So it's just one question. There's no point assigned to it. But we have these other categories for program priorities and for resource priorities. So under program priority, we would have our state priority resource concerns. So you might get some points, higher number of points for having more of these resource concern categories addressed on more land uses, a multiple choice question. And then we have a focus on soil health, because that's in the Farm Bill that CSP should focus on soil health. So we're giving credit for doing soil health activities. And then for resource priorities under the CSP Ag Lands ranking pool, we have a stewardship threshold. So you do have to meet a stewardship threshold to get into CSP, but it's talking about giving credit for more activities that you're doing to meet or exceed more of these resource concern categories. We also, of course, focus on water quality, which is important to us in Pennsylvania, using a systems approach, so multiple, having a suite of practices working together, and then pollinator habitat gets some points too. Next slide. Okay, so then we have CSP, non-industrial private forest land, that set of ranking questions. Sort of similar, we have our state priority resource concerns, gaining some points, most of the points. Then we have some points for having a current forest management plan. So it'd be a plan within 10 years would be considered current. And then for the resource priorities section, we have the same thing with the stewardship threshold, getting some weight, and then we have plant structure and composition. So we're looking at plant, wildlife, and fish here and giving some credit for them. if you're doing something for threatened and endangered or species of greatest need, if you're doing something positive in a brook trout reduced watershed, and again, if you're using a systems approach. So I do want to mention here that if you could back up, beginning farmer and socially disadvantaged would have another item included. So it would say, are you a veteran farmer? Because you get some additional points in that category as well. Next. Okay, so then I want to mention conservation innovation grants. So proposals are due May 11th for the National CIG on-farm conservation innovation trials. So this is being offered. Yes.
Ashley, I understood from the chief they expanded that till the 29th this month of May.
Oh, okay.
He just announced it yesterday.
Okay, so that's been updated already. So proposal will be due May 29th. Thank you, Denise. And that's basically a demonstration. So being able to demonstrate on the land to support the adoption of new technologies and the evaluation of new technologies. So that's the demonstration component of CIG, is the on-farm conservation innovation trials. And then we have our PA CIG proposals are due June 15th. You can go to grants.gov. You can enter that announcement number. You can also click on the NRCS website to find a news release for that, which will have the same link. And then we are expecting a national CIG to be announced this month as well, but we haven't heard anything yet. Next slide. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about NWQI, right? Everybody wants to hear about that. So this is a very small version of that watershed map I had shown in the past. We have 5 watersheds. You can see on my bullets there, 2019 was called a readiness phase. Now they've updated that name to call it a planning phase for any new ones we would pick up. But basically what that was developing the watershed assessment plans, finding partners, who's going to do monitoring, how are we going to do outreach. So that was what we did in 2019. And now we're in the implementation phase in 2020, which is where we continue with our outreach. We write conservation plans, we develop contracts, we start to implement and put things out on the landscape to do the good work through NWQI. As far as outreach, we have had people doing outreach in all these watersheds to get people to apply. So we have 3 areas that are in the NWQI, regular NWQI category, and then we have 2 that are specific to source water protection. There's a source water protection pilot that we had 2 watersheds in. So with the applications that came in, we're in the process, as I mentioned, of assessing and planning them, and then they're working on ranking. The next step after ranking will be working toward contracting. Next slide. Okay, so I thought you guys might like to know a little bit about what kind of outreach activities we've been doing. So Warrior Run is in Northumberland County, and they've been doing some interesting and fun, innovative outreach activities. So back in the summer, they had ice cream and electrofishing. You can see in the photo to the right there that they had a turnout of a Plains Duck community, and some of these areas might be a struggle to get people that are interested in participating with the government, but I think that the education is really valuable if we can have people doing work on their own once they get a better understanding of the watershed and the effect the landscape has on the water quality. That might also show the same results we're looking for, whether or not we spend money in those areas. Another thing they did was a pancake breakfast where they had information and speakers. I attended that. And then there's actually a video on the Northumberland County Conservation District's website. It's not showing these events. It's just an outreach video on what NWQI is and where the Warrior Run watershed is. So feel free to check that out if you want to see what's going on with NWQI in Pennsylvania. Next up here is the Upper Yellow and Beaver Creeks. 4 events have been done so far with presentation and materials. They also had flyers at feed stores and conducted door-to-door outreach. They've done outreach through their partners with the Conservation District and the Farm Service Agency. Upper Kishokaquillas had a retirement there, and we have a new district conservationist, so we're going to see I'll be working with her to see what we can do to kind of get a little more outreach in that area. Swatara, that's in Mifflin County. Swatara over in Lebanon, Dauphin, had Fulton Lake Ag Lender meeting and the Penn State Extension Crops Day. They had information and presentation there. And then Maiden Creek had their Young Farmers meeting. There's a photo over to the right. So I just wanted to show you that there have been some interesting outreach activities going on across the state. Next slide. I pulled some numbers here to show what applications we have. So Warrior Run was a new watershed. We have 7 there. Upper Yellow and Beaver Creek in Bedford area, that was an existing watershed. We have 16 there. Upper Kish was an existing watershed. We have 3 there. And then Swatara Creek was a new NWQI source water protection watershed. They have 21. And then Maiden Creek, which was existing and now coded as a source water protection, has 19. Up in the top corner there, you can't see it very well, but that's kind of our planning process. They plan, we would work with the folks on a plan, take an application, see if they're eligible for the program, do the ranking, and then hopefully get implementing the project on the ground. Next. Okay, then the next topic was the designation of practices with high priority and source water protection practices. So NRCS nationally asked the states to solicit input and select up to 10 practices for EQIP General and up to 10 practices for EQIP NWQI source water protection. So these were practices that were going to receive a higher payment rate. So if you have a contract with us through one of our programs, you might get 50 to 75% of what you pay back as a payment for your incentive payment through your contract for doing that work to our standards and specs. So we're actually going to increase the payment or expected payment on these practices to 90%. And then the goal was to actually introduce practices that may be overlooked. So these are practices that need to have increased exposure, practices that might have high environmental benefit, but also a high cost of installation that's preventing people from doing those. Next. Next slide, please. So here you can see the practices that were designated under these 2 categories. For high priority, we have 10 there. Hopefully you can see that: prescribed burning, riparian herbaceous cover, stream habitat improvement, aquatic organism passage, tree and shrub site prep, and tree and shrub establishment. Those were going to be in specific areas. We haven't mapped that out yet, but for abandoned mine lands, stream bank and shoreline protection, denitrifying bioreactor, wetland restoration, and phosphorus removal system. So those were 10. And then for source water protection, we came up with 5 for those areas that I just showed you. So that would be well decommissioning, karst sinkhole treatment, stream bank shoreline protection, denitrifying bioreactor, and phosphorus removal system. So I kind of have this little image down below to remind us that source water protection, we're actually interested in cleaning up water that can be used for our drinking water system. So the reason we're picking these is because they would affect surface or groundwater. Next slide. That is all I have. I will take questions. The picture here is of a previous year's Ag Progress Days. That's something I also help with planning. And we're still in the planning for that, so we'll see whether or not that gets canceled this year. But any questions this time for those programs? Or comments from Barry and Denise?
Ashley, just like I said previously, because of the workload and some of this situation with the COVID-19, the contracts are off schedule. We will probably not be adding any new NWQI areas until we see where the Upper Kish is. That's one of them that we have in the state that we have a hard time getting sign-ups because they're very, it's in Mifflin County, and most of the area is very strict Amish, old order Amish. So if we add any more NWQI areas, we would look to decommission one. So we're going to see how things roll with this Upper Kish surface water protection in the next year. And we'll probably look to potentially add more NWQI areas in 2022 because it does take a lot of staff. It takes a lot of outreach and to get these kind of rolling and up and going for New Year's, every New Year. And in reality, most states have about 3. We have 5 going, which is more than what we're required to have at the national level. But each of these has, there's a certain reason for them, and we're just trying to target more funding to certain areas. So with that said, I'll just open it up for any questions.
Yeah, and Denise, I see that there's a question on the chat line asking about how the high priority questions were selected.
Yes, I see that. So go ahead.
So those high priority questions, those practices were selected based on the associate wanted to make sure that we were not getting attention to existing practices where there were pre-existing programs that offered other alternatives. There was something that would have a huge environmental benefit, but we haven't been able to move out because of higher cost, or they were something that we wanted to try and demo in certain areas. So that's why those high priority practices have been added to the list.
Thank you, Denise. Are there any other questions related to programs for Barry or Ashley?
I'll comment a little more on that last question, I guess. So that was sent to a subset of the State Technical Committee, and people did rate those based on which they thought were most important for the work that we do and for the source water with the water quality. Barry, do you have anything else you were going to add there too?
Just that we were looking in the general categories of water quality. That was one that was specifically listed in the legislation, but we looked also at habitat. So we tried to find some practices, as Denise said, that we didn't think the funding level was the limiting factor. It might have been awareness or maybe a high cost to do some things, and we just wanted to try to get some things done that we're not getting done already now with our regular application request lines.
An example might be the prescribed burning. Because of the Pennsylvania state requirements for prescribed burn, it's very hard to get licensed vendors who want to come into the state to do burns. It's also one of the most maybe cost-effective ways that we can do restoration on some areas. So the enticement to add that to 90% was to see if we could get some out-of-state vendors to come in and potentially try the prescribed burn. Also, after it went through a subcommittee, it went out to the State Technical Committee, and we took your votes for those of you who wanted to participate. And this is what came back as high priority practices. So,
very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there another question?
No, I just said thank you.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, Barry and Ashley. We appreciate that. We're going to switch up the agenda slightly right now. The next presentation is going to come from Susan Morcourt, the Assistant State Conservationist for Partnerships, and she has a talk on RCPP. So, Susan, I have your presentation up whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Tim. I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about RCPP. Next slide. Right now, we are currently soliciting applications for our alternative funding arrangements portion of RCPP. I'll call it AFA, was first included in the 2014 Farm Bill, and it's been expanded in the 2018 Farm Bill. Right now, there's up to $50 million available nationwide for the alternative funding arrangements, and we do have a statutory restriction in the Farm Bill of a maximum of 15 projects through this announcement. Next. Many of the requirements for the AFA are similar to the classic RCPP, and the funding must be split 50-50 between the critical conservation areas and the state and multi-state pool. The conservation benefits must be shown in the application, and the resource concerns that are designated in that state, multi-state, or CCA pool must be addressed in your proposals. We're also looking for partner contributions, and they're still critical, and our goal is at least one-to-one contribution from the partners and NRCS. Our minimum funding amount is $250,000, and the maximum is $10 million, and that is the same requirements, maximum and minimum, that are in the RCPP Classic. The 70-30 FATA financial assistance, technical assistance split is also the same in AFA as it is in the Classic RCPP, and the eligibility criteria for the lead partners is the same in AFA as it is in the Classic RCPP. Next. So the RCPP principles are the same also within RCPP Classic and the AFA. We are looking for an impact from your project. So we're expecting partners to identify exactly what the impact of their project is going to be, especially in this case on the state of Pennsylvania. We're looking at partner contributions. We'd like to see at least an equal partner contribution with the NRCS contribution. We're looking for innovation in your projects, and we're looking for something that is not something that would ordinarily be done through the RCPP Classic program. So we're looking for something new and different. And the partnership and project management has to be demonstrated in the application that the partners that are able to do this project have the ability to manage the project and provide the technical assistance that's needed. Next. So the AFA is really designated for a kind of a different project than what you'd see in RCPP Classic. We're looking for innovative approaches that do not rely on existing NRCS program operations. We're looking for projects that cannot be effectively carried out using the RCPP Classic approach. And we're looking for projects that can be entirely managed and implemented by the lead partner in collaboration with the other partners, with the exception of some inherently governmental activities, and can be done in more like grant projects. So the inherently governmental activities that we're referring to are things like the determination of eligibility of the people who would apply for funding through this, as well as the NEPA requirements that are responsible to be followed in the delivery of the program. Next. So there are similar activities authorized under the AFA. They could be land management type projects. They could be land rental projects. It could be for entity-held easements. And the note below, there is not going to be any U.S.-held easements in the AFA projects. All of the easements will have to be held by an entity or a partner that's a party to this AFA. And we can also do watershed and public works types project under AFA. Next. So the lead partners that are responsible for these AFA projects must be able to carry out all of the FA and the TA activities themselves. So they really need to have access to the producer networks and have the capability to provide funding and technical assistance to the producers or landowners that they're working with. The only part that NRCS will play is doing the inherently governmental items. Like I mentioned, the eligibility requirements, making sure that applicants meet the eligibility for NRCS funding, and we will oversee and ensure that the NEPA requirements are carried out in the project. The proposals were originally due on May 18th, but we did find out this week that that has been extended. The proposals now are due no later than May 29th. So there's a few extra days there to work on your applications. Next. Also this week, we had the RCPP Classic announcements on the 16th. Actually, I guess that was last week. So those were announced. We were able to get 3 projects in Pennsylvania, almost $14 million worth of projects that came into the state of Pennsylvania. The first project that we got, and these are for the RCPP Classics proposals that were submitted a couple of months ago. One of the projects was the Kittatinny Ridge Conservation Landscape, and a lead partner in that project was Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. Almost $10 million for that project, and that funding came out of the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Critical Conservation Area. So that project is going to be a combination of easements as well as conservation implementation, planning, and implementation of practices in the area of the Kittatinny Ridge in Pennsylvania. The second project was Ag BMP implementation at Chesapeake Bay, and the lead partner there is Berks County Conservation District. And that project will be in the Chesapeake Bay portion of Berks County, and that's the extent of that project, just in that portion of Berks County. And again, that will be basically conservation planning and conservation practice implementation. Next. The third and last project that we got for RCPP Classic was the Buffalo Creek Watershed Conservation Alliance, and the lead partner there was the Audubon Society of Western Pennsylvania. That project, $1.1 million, funding out of the state and multi-state pool. That project will take place in Armstrong, Butler, and Allegheny counties in the Buffalo Creek watershed, and it will be a combination of conservation planning and implementation, as well as some work on endangered threatened species in that watershed as well. I think that was the last slide.
Susan, we had 2 questions come in on the chat. The first question is, what is lead partner? Is that the sole landowner?
Okay, the lead partner would be the partner entity or group that would be putting in the application for the RCPP project. And that lead partner then would be working with all of the other partners in the project, as well as working with us at NRCS to discuss the project and put forth the application.
Okay, thank you, Susan. And the next question, is there more detail available on the first 2 RCPP projects?
At this point, we don't have anything very specific. I am leaving this meeting to go to a training where we're going to be starting to put this information together, so we can get something out to the State Technical Committee with some more information on what these projects entail.
Perhaps, Susan, is Stephanie Zimmerman on, or Dean Druckenmiller? Just a little bit on the Kittatinny Ridge. The innovation that's involved in this project really came forward through the Department of Defense funds to match with the state funds as well as NRCS funds and land protection. So there'll be a large conservation easement component up and down the Kittatinny Ridge. There is also a partnership with the Game Commission and DC and others as well as the local districts to actually go out and do forest management plans on the ridge, and as well as ag conservation practices and forest management practices. So that's the detail at this point in time. But what made that one, you can see that there was a sizable match to the Kittatinny Ridge, over $38 million worth of match to match NRCS's $9 million that was given for land acquisition. So there's going to be a large land acquisition component, in specifically protecting a lot of probably stream sources and that kind of thing along the ridge, and then as well as ag conservation practice work lower in the lower valley. And then as in addition to that, the Berks County, I think there was some questions, that will be just in the Berks County portion of the watershed, and we will be doing traditional conservation practice work in Berks County. The innovation involved in that one is that we're looking at potentially trying out some of those very similar practices that we just talked about with the 90% cost share, such as nitrogen bioreactors and phosphorus removal structures in those areas. So those are some of the things that we're looking at.
And Susan, there was a follow-up question, or rather clarification on the first question. So the lead partner cannot be sole landowner?
That's correct. It needs to be one of the entities that are applicable that is listed in the RCPP funding announcement. So they're looking for entities like conservation district, institutions of higher learning, state departments of agriculture or environmental protection. They're looking for those big overarching partners to be the lead partner on a project and really be able to run the project, the practices and everything, and keep track of managing the project over the whole scope of the project. Now, a landowner that would want to apply would go into NRCS like they do with other programs and put in an application for an RCPP project on their own land.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Are there any other questions? All right, I think we'll move on to our next presentation then. Our next presenter is Hathaway Jones, who is our Easement Programs Manager out of the Harrisburg NRCS office to cover some easement topics. So Hathaway, I will bring your presentation up right now.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you well.
Awesome. Okay, great. So this is the easements update for this meeting. Next slide, please. First, I'm going to talk about ALE program update. Next slide. So we've completed the ALE program ranking, and those ranking questions have been entered into our new system, CART, as ranking fund pools. And we have released these questions to you in a PDF attachment for today's meeting. so you can review them. The national ranking questions listed are required verbatim directly from ALE policy. And then the state questions, there's a little more flexibility with those. They're selected by Pennsylvania for use with our ALE program here, and they follow recommendations set forth in policy, but they aren't required to be used verbatim. So take a look at those. We welcome your comments and feedback on the rankings for this fiscal year. Next slide, please. And for ALE this year, the new Farm Bill has given us flexibility to use a different type of agreement for funding. Traditionally, for ag preservation, we've used cooperative agreements, and those agreements tie funding directly to the statement of work itself, and therefore those agreements have to go through a higher level of scrutiny and additional approvals before we can get them signed and use the funding that's attached to them. So this program agreement option allows us more flexibility because it separates the agreement into a statement of work, which is not tied to any funding. That's just signed by both parties. And then attached to that statement of work are individual contracts related to each parcel that we would fund through ALE. And the money is tied to those individual contracts that are referenced in the statement of work. And that means that we're dealing with smaller dollar value contracts for one for each parcel instead of one large agreement. And that allows us to have more flexibility in how we fund these projects, and less time is needed, less approvals are needed, less paperwork is needed to get to the end of the road, which is enrolling farms and preserving them. Next slide, please. And here's a comparison between the two types of agreements. Of course, cooperative agreements are still available. Program agreements are the new animal that is also available for ALE funding. And in the application process, entities can choose which type of agreement they prefer to use. And this is a comparison of the two types of agreements very briefly in this slide. Okay, next slide, please. Our application deadline is May 1st. We may have some flex on that if people are having trouble meeting that date. Our goal is to do our due diligence and ranking throughout May and June. June 26th is the national guideline deadline for submitting our draft agreements for review and approval. July 31st is our tentative deadline for executing agreements. And August 21st, we should be finishing all the steps to obligate the funding. Because when we go into September, the final date that we can actually secure that funding through all of our processes is September 9th. Next slide, please. And that brings us to WRE, our other ASEP program. So I'd like to update you on the GARC rates. They were submitted to you early on this fiscal year, preliminary submission, but our national office found some flaws in our GARC values based on how the realtor or the realty company that did our assessment assessed the values. So we're going back and having the analysis, the realty analysis revised so that we can meet the NHQ standards. And once we have those updated values, we will provide them to you at the next meeting, which is in July. Next slide, please. Also in process is the Wetland Restoration Criteria and Guidelines document, WRCG, and this is kind of a Pennsylvania-specific document that, our policy and regulations are very general for the entire spectrum of NRCS across the country. And so this document pulls out guidelines and technical information that helps Pennsylvania NRCS make decisions about the Wetland Reserve Program in our state. So it's a very important document, and we are putting it together, and that will be released to you for review and comment once we are finished with that. But that's going on as well right now. Next slide, please. WRE program rankings have been finalized, and they have been also uploaded into the CART system that we're now using as ranking pools. We didn't have any significant changes from last year. The big change was that last year the National Office did not regulate how many points we could use in our ranking, and this year they told us our maximum points allowed is 400. So we revised the form to use a maximum of 400 points, and that is the change, the big change that you'll see in the ranking, actually the only change. So that ranking, we have a Bog Turtle Massasauga on our regular, and those rankings have been provided to you for your review and comment. Next slide, please. And these are our WRE deadlines. They follow a very similar path to ALE, and these are based on guidelines released to us from our national office. So you'll see May and June, we're working on ranking and due diligence. End of June, we want to select applications. July, we want to be finalizing all of our documentation, getting everything ready. And in August, we want to be obligating our funding in time for our final deadline of September 9th, our end of year cutoff. And that's our WRE schedule. Next slide, please. And that's all I had. If anyone has questions, let me know. Okay. No questions. Thanks, everybody. And I'll talk to you next meeting.
Thank you, Hathaway. We appreciate that. And at this point, is that a question? I don't think so. Okay. We'll pass it over to Denise to close out the meeting.
Appreciate everybody's attendance today. Thank you for your input. We will get these presentations out to everyone. I just want to remind folks that we do have, we announced the state CIG, and the deadline for applications is June 15th. So looking forward to seeing some CIG potential demonstrations on farms or some other things that may take place of taking research technology and actually putting conservation work on farm fields. So I know that we have some entities that are members of the State Technical Committee that are interested in applying for CIG. So just want to send a reminder that that deadline is the 15th of June. So looking forward to receiving applications on that. Generally, we have a one-to-one match, and we grant up to $75,000 for a project. So with that said, do we have anything else that needs to be discussed today? We're happy to take any questions or comments you may have. Okay, hearing none. Thank you all for your comments. If you have any, would like anything specifically on the agenda for next State Technical Committee, or you yourself would like to present at some point in time, we welcome that. Please feel free to get a hold of either Susan Marquardt or myself, and we will make sure to schedule you on the agenda. Thank you.